Hey everyone! Are you ready to explore some English idioms with me today?
I'm excited. It's a topic that never gets old.
Right. I actually got inspired by a podcast episode someone shared with me.
Oh, yeah.
It's from the Simple Pod called How to Use English Idioms Like a Native Speaker. And I have to say, it's got my wheels turning.
It's amazing how much you can learn about a culture from its idioms.
Yeah.
Like little windows into how people think and communicate.
Totally. But here's something I've been wondering. Have you ever noticed that some idioms seem to just fit better in certain situations?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, I can't imagine saying break a leg in a business meeting.
Right. That would definitely raise some eyebrows.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So context is key.
Definitely.
Yeah.
The podcast mentioned think outside the box, being common in professional settings. But even then, you have to be careful.
Oh, for sure.
Like using a casual idiom like piece of cake during a serious presentation.
Yeah.
That could come across as a little too flippant.
Interesting. So it's not just about knowing the meaning, it's about using them appropriately.
Exactly. It's like anything else in language. You have to develop a feel for what's appropriate in different contexts.
Which brings me to another point. The podcast mentions some pretty common idioms like hit the sack and break a leg.
Yeah, those are classics.
But I'm curious, have you ever come across any idioms that just tripped you up, even after you knew what they meant?
Oh, totally. All the time, actually.
Yeah.
Especially early on in my career when I was still getting used to the nuances of English. I remember once I was trying to encourage a student to be more direct, and I said, don't beat around the bush. And he just looked at me completely bewildered.
I can imagine.
Later, it hit me that the imagery of beating around the bush might not translate well across cultures.
Yeah. That's a perfect example of how idioms can be so deeply rooted in a culture's history and experiences.
Right.
And speaking of history, the podcast talked about the origins of bite the bullet and spill the beans. And I was fascinated by how those seemingly random phrases actually have these really interesting historical roots.
Yeah, the podcast talked about how bite the bullet comes from battlefield medicine, with soldiers literally biting down on a bullet during surgery.
Wow. I had no idea.
It's kind of a grim image when you think about it.
Yeah, it really is. But it's also a reminder of how language evolves over time.
Exactly. And how even the most casual phrases can have these echoes of the past embedded in them.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Absolutely. And what's interesting about bite the bullet is that it also speaks to a certain cultural attitude. This idea of facing hardship with grit and determination.
Almost like a cub for resilience.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about how idioms reflect culture and history, but beyond just knowing the meaning and the origin, what are some practical ways that we can actually incorporate these idioms into our daily English?
That's a great question. And the podcast offers some really good advice, like encouraging active practice and suggesting things like watching movies and TV shows. But I think we can go a step further. Have you ever thought about how paying attention to the tone of a conversation can help you choose the right idiom?
That's an interesting point. So you wouldn't use a humorous idiom in a serious conversation, for instance.
Exactly. That's something the podcast didn't really touch on, but it's crucial for sounding natural and avoiding awkward situations.
I see what you mean. So using the right idiom at the right time can actually add a layer of humor or empathy, even authority to what you're saying.
Precisely.
Okay, so it's like adding the right seasoning to a dish.
That's a great analogy. Too much or the wrong kind can really ruin the flavor.
Exactly. But knowing how to use idioms effectively can really elevate your communication skills.
You got it.
This is already giving me a lot to think about, but I feel like we're just scratching the surface of this whole world of English idioms.
We are. There's so much more to explore.
Awesome. Well, we'll have to continue our deep dive in part 2.
Sounds good to me.
Welcome back to our deep dive into English idioms. Before the break, we were talking about how context and tone can really make or break your use of idioms.
Right. You can know the meaning of an idiom inside and out, but still mess it up if you use it in the wrong situation.
Totally. I think that's why so many people find idioms tricky.
Yeah, I think the podcast's advice about active practice is really key here. They talked about watching movies and shows, which is great. But I think you need to go a step further. Don't just passively watch, actively listen for the idioms.
So like taking notes or even repeating the phrases out loud.
Exactly. And when you hear an idiom, try to break down the scene. Like, what's the context? Who's saying it? What kind of tone are they using?
That makes sense. It's like you're not just learning the words, you're learning how to use them in a way that feels natural.
Right. Like, imagine you're watching a rom-com. And one of the characters says, I'm head over heels for them.
Okay.
Pay attention to how they deliver that line. Is it playful? Is it heartfelt? Or is it maybe even a little bit sarcastic?
I see what you mean. You're basically learning the different shades of meaning within a single idiom.
Exactly. And then think back to what the podcast said about incorporating idioms into your daily conversations.
Yeah, but like you said, don't just force them in.
Right. Listen for opportunities where an idiom would naturally fit.
So like instead of saying, I'm very tired, you could say, I'm ready to hit the sack, but only if it feels right.
Yeah. The goal is to sound authentic, not like you're trying too hard.
It's almost like using spices when you cook. You don't just dump the whole spice rack into the dish.
Exactly. You choose the ones that complement the other flavors.
That's such a good analogy. It makes the whole idea of using idioms seem less intimidating.
I think so too. It's about carefully selecting the idioms that add depth and nuance to your communication, not just throwing them around randomly.
And just like with cooking, experimenting is key, right?
Absolutely. Try out different idioms in different situations. See what works, what doesn't. You might be surprised at how a well-placed idiom can really make your speech sparkle.
It's like finding the perfect idiom for the perfect moment.
Exactly. So we've got movies, we've got everyday conversations.
Are there any other resources out there that can help us learn idioms?
Oh, tons. Remember how the podcast talked about the challenge of using one new idiom a day?
Yeah.
Well, there are apps and websites specifically designed to help you do that. They've got daily idiom lessons, quizzes, even flashcard decks.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
And don't forget about good old-fashioned books.
Oh, right.
There are dictionaries dedicated entirely to idioms. They have detailed explanations, example sentences, even interesting historical tidbits.
So it's like we have this whole treasure trove of resources just waiting to be discovered.
Exactly.
Okay.
The key is to find what works best for you and your learning style.
But with all this talk about resources and techniques, I think it's important to take a step back and ask ourselves, so what? Why should anyone care about mastering English idioms?
Good point. It's one thing to learn about them, but what's the real benefit? Well, for starters, using idioms correctly can make you sound more fluent and natural in English.
Right, which can be a huge confidence booster.
Absolutely. Especially when you're interacting with native speakers. It's like you're speaking their language, not just grammatically correct English, but the kind of English that's full of cultural references and shared understanding.
It's about connecting on a deeper level.
Exactly. And that can open so many doors, whether it's in your personal life, your career, even just when you're traveling and experiencing new cultures.
It's about going beyond the words themselves and really tapping into the heart of a language.
Absolutely.
Okay, before we get too carried away, let's take a moment to recap what we've talked about so far.
Sure. We've covered the importance of context and tone when using idioms, explored how active listening and practice can help you internalize them, and even delved into the incredible resources available to support your learning journey.
But we're not done yet. There's still more to uncover in our quest to unlock the secrets of English idioms. Join us for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore the cultural significance of idioms even further and leave you with a final, thought-provoking challenge.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive.
So we've been talking a lot about the practical side of English idioms, like how to use them correctly.
Right.
But I think it's also important to remember that idioms aren't just about language. They're about culture, too.
Absolutely. Each idiom carries a little piece of a culture's history, its values, even its sense of humor.
We talked about bite the bullet reflecting a kind of stoicism.
Right.
But what other examples come to mind when you think about idioms that really reflect cultural values?
Well, take the phrase, pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Okay.
It embodies a very individualistic spirit, right? This idea that success comes from hard work and self-reliance.
Yeah.
And that really resonates in cultures that emphasize personal responsibility and achievement.
It's like a cultural motto packed into a simple phrase.
Exactly. And it makes you realize that learning a language isn't just about vocabulary and grammar.
Right.
It's about understanding the cultural mindset that shapes those words.
That's so true. And sometimes those cultural differences can lead to some pretty funny misunderstandings.
Oh, tell me about it. I remember once when I was traveling, I tried to use the idiom to kill two birds with one stone, thinking it was a universally understood concept.
Oh.
Turns out, in that particular culture, the imagery of killing birds, even metaphorically, was not well received.
I can imagine.
There's a good reminder that even when you have good intentions, using idioms can backfire if you're not aware of the cultural context.
Yeah, it's like a reminder to approach language learning with humility.
Definitely. And it highlights how idioms can be deceptively complex.
They seem so simple on the surface.
Right. But they're actually layered with all these cultural nuances. They're like little puzzles that, once you unlock them, can give you a much deeper understanding of the people and their stories.
It's like each idiom is a tiny thread. And as you collect more and more threads, you can weave a richer tapestry of cultural understanding.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And that brings us back to you, our listener.
Yes, we've explored a lot of fascinating aspects of English idioms today, but now we want to hear from you.
What idioms have you come across that sparked your curiosity? Or maybe left you totally confused?
Maybe you heard a phrase in a song or a movie, or even just overheard a conversation and thought, what does that even mean? We'd love to hear your stories.
Share those idiom encounters with us. Keep exploring the origins, the cultural context, even the humor behind these phrases.
Because mastering English idioms isn't just about sounding like a native speaker, it's about gaining a deeper appreciation for the richness and complexity of the language.
And the culture it represents. So keep asking questions, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep having fun with language.
Great advice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of English idioms. We hope you learned something new, gained a fresh perspective, and maybe even discovered a new appreciation for the power of these little phrases. Until next time.